Thank you, sir, for kind words. Uh, so, ICP monitoring. So, we will first understand what is the ICP physiology, what causes the ICP to rise, how does it take care, what is auto regulation, and then certain causes and the monitoring equipments. So we are aware that intracranial pressure is the pressure inside the skull and thus in the brain tissue and the cerebrospinal fluid. And the normal values which are less than 10. So the range is there from 7 to 15, but we take pressures which are less than 10 as a normal ICP. Abnormal values, specifically values which are requiring any kind of therapy, that is what is called as abnormal, and that ranges from 20 to 25. So anything which is above 20 would require some or the other kind of therapy, and this is generally indicative of a hydrocephalus or a cerebral edema, a pathology that is happening in the patient. So we all know that the vault is basically an addition of three things. One is the brain volume, the blood volume, and the CSF volume, and anything which changes will change the equation. The brain volume will more or less be the same, which ranges from 78 to 80%, although it is written 85, but generally 80% is what we take as the brain volume. Cerebrospinal fluid will constitute around 10%, and the blood would be the remaining, which is around 5%. So this is very important, that how does the auto regulation or the compensation takes place. What happens earlier is, up till 30 centimeters, up till 30 of an ICP, the brain will try to compensate as far as possible. And how does it try to compensate? It tries to shift the cerebrospinal fluid from the cranial component to the spinal component. So it tries to push the CSF from one component to another. You cannot change the brain volume. What you are trying to change is the other two factors, which is blood and the CSF. And to a very small extent, the blood is also pushed through the venous capillary systems to the other parts. But once this compensation fails, even a very small increase in the volume of the brain would give rise to an exponential rise in the ICP. So intracranial volume is fixed, so you can have only 100%. Now it is up to you what you reduce and what you increase. Expansion of one would displace the other, and again this is how it helps in maintaining the ICP. And if this mechanism fails, the ICP is bound to increase, and that is when you see signs and symptoms. So if you look at the normal, compensated and decompensated, and all the three parts, the purple part which represents the brain is fixed. The arterial volume, which is by the mustard color, is fixed. What is changing here is the mass volume. In a compensated normal ICP, the mass is there, but still you are able to manage with the help of CSF and venous volume. They are both being pushed to the other components, but as the mass volume increases, this is where the decompensation would take place. We are all aware of this terminology, auto-regulation. Now this occurs on a very wide range of mean arterial pressure, of 50 to 150 mmHg, and it's a very instantaneous process. Within 1 to 10 seconds of any change in the pressure would reflect this. Above and below these autoregulatory phase, that is below 50 and above 150, is very difficult, because then your ICP or the cerebral blood flow is totally dependent on the pressure. Whatever the map is, it would reflect accordingly, and the limits are affected by various factors, which include the sympathetic nervous system stimulation and certain therapeutic drugs. So the problem is, autoregulation is limited. It has only a certain range. And if the BP or ICP rises, the autoregulation is bound to fail, and when it fails, the cerebral blood flow would either increase or decrease, and eventually what will happen is cerebral ischemia, cell death, and brain death. So we all know this is the range, as I was talking about, 50 to 150. Below this, as the as the map decreases, there would be ischemia. If it is more than that, you will have luxury perfusion. Again, this is not also good. Normally the PaO2 does not affect cerebral blood flow, and cerebral blood flow dramatically increases once you have hypoxemia. So once you have PaO2 going down below 50, and you find a rise of cerebral blood flow for every in increase in PaCO2, and that is the reason we hyperventilate these patients when we are looking at critical ICP. So normal cerebral blood flow would be 50 ml per 100 grams per minute of brain. So if the flow decreases to 10 to 15 ml, this creates an irreversible neuronal damage. If you are little lucky and you are above that, around 20 milliliters per 100 gram per minute of the flow, the patients can still have a reversible injury, and this is as per the Fick's principle. So the three main factors which determine the cerebral oxygenation are cerebral blood flow, what is the arterial oxygen content, and CMRO2. And CMRO2 is again dependent on temperature as well. So every degree rise in a temperature, that is hyperthermia, will give rise to the metabolic rate of oxygen consumption. We always look at CPP. We don't measure CBF, we measure CPP, and CPP is most frequently used as a surrogate marker for cerebral blood flow. CPP is cerebral perfusion pressure. So the ICP is less than 10 to 15. Intracranial hypertension per se is defined as ICP which is greater than 20 mmHg, and sustained intracranial hypertension is defined as an ICP which is greater than 20 mmHg for 5 minutes or longer. So these are the three basic definitions: normal ICP, ICH, and sustained ICH. Causes: cerebral edema ranks as number 1 cause for any increased ICP. There are other causes like space occupying lesions, CSF flow, so hydrocephalus, increase in the venous pressure, certain metabolic disorders, cerebral flow production has increased, or you have pseudotumor cerebri. So if you look at this chart, there is an insult which leads to tissue edema, which finally causes an ICP rise. Now there is compression of the surrounding blood vessels. This compression will lead to a decrease in the oxygen supply to the brain cells, leading to their death. This death would again stimulate an edema around the necrotic cells. This would again cause an increase in ICP with further compression of now a structural compression. So this would lead to compression of brainstem and other respiratory centers. This would lead to an accumulation of CO2, more vasodilatation, so the cerebral blood flow will increase. Cerebral blood flow is increasing, so you have more ICP again, and this would eventually lead to the death of the patient. So why do we need monitoring? We need monitoring because we are worried at two factors. We are worried at an ICP of more than 20 and a cerebral perfusion pressure of less than 50. We are worried at these two values. We want to target these two values, and we want to monitor this because these two values predict poor outcome. So CPP is MAP minus ICP. MAP you can easily calculate. How do you calculate ICP? You need a monitor for that. Again, certain people said let us increase the CPP. That doesn't help. So empirically, just boosting the cerebral perfusion pressure by probably increasing your mean arterial pressure also doesn't help these patients. ICP monitoring is important because it allows an early initiation of therapy. It also allows you to judge the response of the therapy. It also captures their certain fluctuations in the ICP, and the Brain Trauma Foundation also supports that we should target a range which is 50 to 70 mmHg in patients with severe traumatic brain injury. So the indications would be in severe head injury with GCS of less than 8, and basically which are salvageable patients. Remember that they said salvageable after resuscitation with a GCS of less than 8. Abnormal CT brain, that is diffuse grade 2 to 4, or a normal CT brain which is diffuse grade 1 plus 2 or more adverse effects, and those adverse effects are age more than 40, systolic blood pressure of less than 90, and decerebrate or decorticate posturing. What I was saying is the same thing, that there is vasogenic edema because of hyperemia. This causes a cerebral blood volume increase, again an intracranial hypertension. CSF volume is increasing either because of obstruction or because of increased production, will give rise to intracranial hypertension. Any increase in the blood, which is like 5%, so hematoma, a space occupying lesion, will give rise to an intracranial hypertension. Ischemia, either because of low PO2, which cause toxic edema, again intracranial hypertension. So there are many physiologies in which you will have intracranial hypertension. So within 24 to 48 hours post trauma, certain areas will remain hypoperfused and infarcted, and the other areas would develop hyperemia because of increased nitric oxide production. And 72 hours post trauma, this leads to an increase in the cerebral blood flow, cerebral blood volume, and eventually both these things in addition will cause increase in the ICP. So the first stage, the early signs would be confusion, drowsiness, slight pupillary and breathing changes if the patients do not have a higher ICP. But as the ICP increases, patients will have widened pulse pressure. They would have bradycardia, irregular respiration, and this is called as Cushing's triad. If the patients don't get managed here, they would lead to stage 3, which is the worst outcome stage. Herniation, more ischemia, small punctate hemorrhages would start, and here the bad part is ICP and MAP, they would become almost similar, and the cerebral blood flow would cease. So the signs and symptoms would be GCS going down, so patients will have altered sensorium. Cranial nerve findings could be there. Eye examination, please check the pupillary signs. That is very, very important whenever we are looking at an ICP monitoring in patients. A CT scan would show ventricular cistern abnormalities or midline shift. So the basal cisterns could be totally compressed. They would be almost chink, and vasogenic edema kind of phenomena. So so total ground glassing appearance, and this is almost like an ICP of more than 20. So intracranial hypertension, as I said, is defined as more than 20 sustained for more than 5 minutes, and the cardinal signs of herniation would be acute onset of unilateral or bilateral pupillary dilatation, and that is the reason I said please check the pupils whenever we are suspecting an increase in the ICP, because you can have a unilateral pupillary dilatation. There would be loss of light reactivity. Patients can have loss of consciousness, and they can have certain posturing, whether this is extensor posturing or other signs like hypertension, bradycardia, and changes in the respiratory pattern. These are the areas where they would have herniation. So whether this is cingulate or transtentorial or uncal herniation, this is the most common area where they would have uncal herniation, and the final event would be tonsillar herniation when the ICP is uncontrollably high. So what are the guidelines? The British Trauma Foundation, Brain Trauma Foundation guidelines are, there are no prospective trials, right? So still they have not been able to give a level 1 evidence to these if you are monitoring indications. So ICP should be monitored in all salvageable, and this is a very key word where they said that it should be monitored only in salvageable patients with traumatic brain injury. GCS of 3 to 8 and an abnormal CT scan. So CT head should have either a hematoma, contusion, swelling, herniation, or compressed basal cistern. Another poor evidence, level 3, you want to measure in normal CT head only if there are 2 additional findings: age 40 and below or 40 and above, systolic blood pressure of less than 90, and posturing of the patient. What are the methods? These are the basic principles of measuring ICP. So whether they could be fluid fill systems, which are normally the ventricular devices, implantable transducer catheter systems, then tympanic membrane displacement systems, transcranial Doppler, a very easy bedside maneuver, optic nerve sheet diameter, again a very easy method, and near infrared spectroscopy. So these are the technology and these are the locations. The commonest and the easiest and the most reliable one is the ventricular or the external ventricular drainage, the EVD, that is put by the surgeons by doing a burr hole. So this is used to quickly reduce. The advantage of EVD is this is both therapeutic as well as diagnostic. So you can drain the CSF if the patient's ICP is increasing, and this is the most widely used device. The transducer can be zeroed externally and the insertion may be difficult or impossible when there is advanced brain swelling. So the ventricles will be totally compressed and then to put an EVD is actually very difficult. So surgeons would not prefer putting an EVD in a totally compressed ventricles. The other ones are intraparenchymal where a typically fiber optic catheter is placed. The advantage is ease of insertion, but the problem is zeroing. You cannot do a repeated zeroing, and so the validation of this device is also not there. Epidural one or the subdural ones, again they cannot correlate truly with the intracranial pressure and the zeroing is an issue. So EVD is the only equipment right now which is validated for measuring the ICP. And these are the monitors. Every institute will have its own, but generally this Pickelberg monitor is there. Codman is there with the wire. It's a costly equipment which is being used, right? But most of the neuro centers which are doing good neuro work will have either of them with them. Then about waveforms. This is asked in exams, right? If you have any neuro case, you will have this question surely. So they are trifid. Intracranial pressure waveforms are trifid in nature and they synchronize with the arterial pulse and they vary with the respiratory cycle. So each wave would be generated by the arterial pulse and a smaller in amplitude, and each waveform, the bigger waveform, these change with the respiratory cycle and they are bigger in the amplitude. So this is how it would look like. The smaller ones are vascular pulse and the bigger entire waveform is the respiratory trace. Now in each trace you can have three upstrokes. So three upstroke in each wave and they are named as P1, P2 and P3. So P1 is the percussion wave, P2 is the tidal wave and P3 is the dicrotic wave. Percussion wave, they represent the arterial pulsations. The P2 wave is very important wave because it represents the intracranial compliance, and the P3 which represents the venous pulsation. So normally P1 is the tallest, P2 is at number 2, P3 is the lowest, and this would represent a normal ICP waveform. So just on eyeballing without doing any measurements, if you find P2 higher than P1, it indicates that the intracranial compliance has gone wrong and there is a rise in the intracranial pressure. So P1 is the tallest, P2 is at number 2, P3 is at number 3. So this is arterial, this is intracranial compliance, and the P3 represents the venous pulsations. So as you can see here in the first graph, P1 is tallest, P2 is at number 3 and P3 is lowest, so this is fine. But just on the eyeballing of the second wave, P2 stands tallest. So this tells that there is a poor compliance because of elevation of P2 and this indicates poor outcome. Now certain more graphs about these waves. If you have this kind of representation on the monitor, this tells either the patient has expired because there are no pulsation, no arterial or venous pulsation, no compliance, or your EVD has clogged or kinked. So please check your equipment if the patient is alive, and if you think that the patient is expired, yes, you will have this kind of waveform. You just have a prominent P1. The P2 and P3 are at normal. P1 represents arterial pulsations, remember. So if you have a prominent P1, this is because the systolic blood pressure is too high. You have a diminished P1. So if systolic blood pressure was high and you had a prominent P1, if the systolic blood pressure would be low, you will have a diminished P1. So systolic BP is low and so the P1 decreases, and eventually P1 and P2, they both appear at the same level. This does not mean that the P2 has gone up. P2, P3 are at the same level, P1 has gone down. Prominent P2, as we said, the intracranial compliance has decreased and so you have a prominent P2. You have both P2 and P3 as diminished, and this is what you see when you hyperventilate these patients. You are decreasing the cerebral blood flow, you are also decreasing the intracranial pressure, and so if you hyperventilate these patients, P2 and P3 would go down. Almost a rounded ICP, and this is ICP critically high where you don't see any waveforms, no P1, no P2 and no P3. Lundberg divided these waves into three categories depending on the pathology. So he said there are A waves, B waves and C waves, and Lundberg A waves were amplitude of 50 to 100 mmHg and they lasted for 5 to 20 minutes, and this was always associated with an intracranial pathology. The amplitude was high, the time period was high, and the outcome was poor. And in coughing, if the patient is coughing and you have an ICP, you will find these kind of waves and they are called as Lundberg waves. Then came the second waves, which were Lundberg B waves. They oscillated at 50 mmHg. The frequency was now lower, 0.5 to 2 per minute, and this was thought to be due to vasomotor center instability. And the third one was C waves. The amplitude was even lower, 20 mmHg. Frequency was higher, which is 4 to 8 per minute, and this was documented in healthy individuals. So he divided these pressure waves into 3 waves, A, B and C, depending on the disability. So the typical events when you have a low and stable ICP, for example, which are seen in mild head injury or uncomplicated head injury patients, then the ICP would rise eventually and it goes above 20. The most common picture that you see following all head injuries, the ICP waves related to the changes in arterial pressure and hyperemic events would start appearing, and if you have a refractory intracranial hypertension, this usually leads to death unless and until radical measures are being taken. So the limitations are these are mostly studied in traumatic brain injury, and again the evidence is not very strong. Certain centers would do it, certain centers refrain from doing it. Infection, bleeding is a major complication, and availability about the equipment and doing it and interpreting it. So expertise about procedure and interpretation of ICP waves is also needed. Infection stands as the most common complication. Hemorrhage is the second most common complication of ICP measuring because you need to insert the catheter. There could be certain times fracture of the catheter, malfunction of the device, difficulty in placement if the patient has severe cerebral edema and the ventricles are totally collapsed, and difficult to assess the true rate of some of these issues because the literature has different definitions, what is bleeding and what is breakage and all that stuff. When do you remove it? You remove the catheter only when the ICP is less than 20 for at least 24 hours without treatment. That is the indication of removal of an ICP monitor. The treatment has to stop, the ICP has to be less than 20 and at least for 24 hours. Certain factors like hemodynamic instability, operative monitoring is required, or your clinical judgment know that the patient is probably not stable. This is where you would like to continue it for a longer period. Other in non-invasive techniques, ocular sonography, ONSD, now it is being done very routinely. More if the ICP, if the optic nerve sheet diameter is more than 5.7 mm, now the literature is coming up to 5.4 mm as well. The ICP of more than 20 is 95% surety, right? So optic nerve sheet diameter is a very useful modality, a bedside modality. Transcranial Doppler, you can do a middle cerebral artery Doppler, so you can look at the M1, M2 waves, even posterior circulation, again a bedside technique. Little bit training is required when you want to measure this. You look at the peak velocity, the diastolic velocity, mean velocity, you take out the Porcellet index. Intraocular pressure can be done with the help of an ultrasound handheld optic tonometry, and tympanic membrane displacement. Again, these two would require a little more extensive training, but these two techniques are very easily done in the ICU. Thank you.